All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's Taos seminar. Very happy this week to have Jake Mulholland. Jake is actually from this area, from Long Island originally, so I know he's excited to be here. Jake's currently an assistant professor at Albany, friends up at SUNY Albany. And for his undergrad, Jake actually went to SUNY Oswego, so hitting all the SUNY stops. After that, Jake went on to Illinois, University of Illinois, the main campus, and did a master's degree with Jeff Frame on, that was lake effect snow, so yeah. And then did his PhD with Jeff Trapp and Steve Nesbitt, looking at terrain influences on convection. So following his PhD, Jake was an NRC postdoc at Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey with John Peters, who was then a faculty member there and now at Penn State. Jake stuck around Monterey for a few years as research faculty, and then took a trip to the University of North Dakota, where he was an assistant professor for a couple of years before he came over to Albany this past fall. So Jake specializes in atmospheric convection, a lot of modeling of convection, whether it be supercells or MCSs, or looking at convection initiation. And so we're really excited to have him as part of the SUNY family. And today he's going to be talking about some work that, of course, I'm very interested in. And I hope the rest of you are as well. So there will be lunch afterward in the Swanson room. If you want to come meet and say hello to Jake, encourage that. So without further ado, Jake, go ahead.
Yep. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Hopefully you can hear me, especially the online folks. Normally, I like to walk around, but I'm going to use the laser pointer just so the online folks can see what I'm actually pointing to on the screen. So thank you for the invitation, Mike, for coming out today. So that's my first acknowledgement, Dr. Michael French, and this lovely photo I found on Google of Michael. I'm not sure when that was, but some conference. And then also Trish, who really helped arrange all the travel and stuff. So I really appreciate her for all of that help. And of course, Stony Brook for hosting me. That hotel, by the way, on campus is beautiful. I don't know if anyone stayed there. That breakfast was probably the best I've ever had in a hotel. So that was a plus. Still the acknowledgements in terms of like the research I'll be showing today, the co-authors. First one I'd like to thank is Chris Nowatarski from Texas A&M. And then John Peters from Penn State. Hugh Morrison, who's at NCAR. He's actually lost more hair than that now. He actually has no hair. And then Eric Nielsen over at Texas A&M as well. So these are my co-authors on the paper and the research that I'll be presenting today. All right, so Mike gave a great overview of this, so I won't spend too much time, but I was originally born on Long Island. So again, this is somewhat home. I was born on the South Shore, not the North Shore. Grew up in Lindenhurst until 2001. And then my family moved up to Syracuse because my dad worked for the DOT for 40 years, plowing snow, and they get a lot more lake effect in Syracuse than they do on Long Island. So the extra overtime helped. It was cheaper to live, so we moved up to Syracuse. So that's why I went to SUNY Oswego instead of Stony Brook, because it was right next to my hometown, most of my childhood in Syracuse. There I was fortunate to be part of 2 NSF field projects to study lake effect snow, one being the OWLS project, which motivated my master's research into lake effect at the University of Illinois. There I studied with Jeff Frame, looking at small scale circulations along horizontal shear zones within lake effect snow bands, using dual Doppler analysis and also WRF simulations. And then I stayed there for my PhD, like Mike said, with Jeff and Jeff Trapp, Steve Nesbitt, looking at orographic convection over South America. I got to be part of the NSF Relámpago field campaign and live in Argentina for 2 months, forecasting and launching weather balloons down in that part of the world. I kept going west to work with John at the Naval Postgraduate School for a couple of years, looking at sort of entrainment impacts on deep convection and how we can better parameterize convective updrafts. And then I decided to try to make my loop back toward New York and went to the University of North Dakota for 2 years. Suffice it to say, my wife did not enjoy the winters there. High temperatures were -50 sometimes degrees Fahrenheit. So yeah, after 2 years of that, decided to apply for the Albany job when it opened up and was fortunate enough to get that. So that's where I'm landed at now. I will say my wife's also in the field, and she went to Texas A&M for her PhD and then Colorado State for her postdoc. So I've also spent some time living in those two locations. So I've really got a nice tour of the US here. Not so much the Southeast or the Northwest, but good chunk of the Central and the shores here. All right, so outside of work, some things I like to do. I do storm chase courses with different universities, helping them lead those. Here's me launching weather balloons in South America. A lot of family time sports. Here's our dog Kip and our daughter Amelia when she was younger. Here's my wife during COVID here. Also, I'm really into train photography. So I'm like the only person who likes to be stopped by trains at crossings when they go by, and I don't complain that they're stopping me. Here's some more pictures of my daughter Amelia. In North Dakota in the winter, the only thing you can do for exercise is walk around the buildings. So this was actually the Atmospheric Science building. We brought our daughter there to just do laps back and forth in the building there. And then she likes to eat crackers vertically instead of horizontally. I don't know why, but she's learning. So she's 19 months old now. All right. So today's presentation, 45 minutes-ish of talking and then 15 minutes for Q&A. I'll be talking about the research for about 35 minutes, and then sort of the future work I hope to achieve and sort of the ongoing work I'm working on right now. And then again, try to reserve at least 10-15 minutes for Q&A from students and faculty. All right, so the latest research, this was an article that came out in the fall time in Monthly Weather Review, and it is investigating the influence of vertical wind shear on updraft characteristics and also hydrometeor concentrations and distributions within supercell thunderstorms. So let's begin. Just a brief review. What are supercells? They're single isolated rotating updrafts called mesocyclones. They often produce severe weather rates. So think about tornadoes, damaging winds, large hail. And their name actually derives from the biological sciences, a single long-lasting cell, such as in a human body, let's say. Here are just a picture and a GIF animation of what these look like, showing that nice striated structure, the visual manifestation of the rotation within these long-lasting systems that sometimes can last 8+ hours in duration. So they form via tilting and stretching of horizontal vorticity derived from environmental wind shear in the environment. So here is literally just a screen grab from the Markowski and Richardson textbook showing that winds changing speed and direction with height, leading to this tube of horizontal vorticity that then through the storm relative winds get effected toward a developing updraft, tilted, and then stretch vertically, which then gives you that visual manifestation of the rotation here. All right, so the shear in the background environment, right? Horizontal winds changing speed or direction with height has long been thought to increase supercell longevity. One of the main ideas is that the strong storm relative winds aloft associated with that strong shear help to displace the hydrometeor mass and the downdrafts away from the main updraft region, allowing the updraft to continually feed on more moist, high Cape air and continue to persist compared to something, let's say, like an ordinary convective updraft in weak shear that goes up and then rains into its own updraft. So clearly, having some shear is important for the longevity of this special class of thunderstorms. Now, where this precip core is located in supercells has been shown to be important for things such as tornado genesis. So where the precip falls out helps determine where the negatively buoyant air underneath supercells develops. So that's the cold pool. And if the cold pool is able to be restrained from undercutting the updraft or not. Also, outflow surges. So surges in the cold pool that have instigated tornado genesis has been shown to be important. And also where supplemented low-level horizontal vorticity exists due to horizontal gradients in buoyancy. So going from the cold pool air to the warm environmental air that can generate horizontal vorticity as well. So a nice paper that came out a couple of years ago by Frame looked at idealized simulations in which they varied the wind shear above, I think it was in the 3 to 6 kilometer layer, whether they backed the winds with height or veered the winds with height, shown on this this photograph plot here. And that really led to different regions where this precip core fell out. So these are plan views looking down at the near surface reflectivity in the black contour. The blue is theta rho prime. So this is the cold pool shown in the dark blue. The red is the updraft contours, and then the yellow here is showing where the heaviest precipitation is. And then you have storm relative winds in the back. So when the winds were backing with height, the precip fell more near the rear flank of the storm, whereas if the winds veered with increasing height in the mid-levels, that it fell more in the forward flank of the storm. Now, stronger shear in these supercell environments has been shown to lead to faster storm motions. So increasing shear, the storms tap into a stronger steering current and can move faster, resulting in stronger low-level storm relative inflow. And through a mass continuity argument, you can show that this leads to wider updrafts that are less diluted by environmental air and can result in stronger updrafts. So here's some work by John Peters and co-authors showing as you go from bottom to top, you have increasing shear, increasing storm relative flow. And these are plan view plots again of reflectivity shaded, the cold pool in the contours, and mid-level updraft, 20 meter per second, I believe, shown in the black contour. So you see the storms themselves get bigger, the updrafts get bigger, and the cold pool is a little bit more restrained from undercutting the updraft if you have stronger shear. And then they showed strong relationships between shear and inflow, which then relates to the size of updrafts, how much boundary layer air is able to be transported up without being diluted, stronger buoyancy, and result in stronger vertical velocities in these stronger shear environments. So robust relationships, all of these quantities relating back to the vertical wind shear. So to visually see the impact of updraft size on the entrainment properties, here were a couple of animations John shared with me. This is just a single warm bubble initialized in a no wind shear environment, either on the left being a narrow bubble, on the right being a wide bubble. Blue is up, red is down. And you can see on the left here, the updraft structure is a lot different than on the right. Here on the left, you get these discrete pulses, or thermals as we call them, of upward moving air that are disjoint from regions below it, and it doesn't penetrate as high into the troposphere. Whereas on the right, it's more of a continuous plume of ascent from the boundary layer up through the upper troposphere. Stronger vertical velocities, and you can tell that the core is better protected from all that environmental air than in this situation. Here's just snapshots, cross sections through updrafts and weak shear on the left, strong shear on the right. Red now is up, blue is down, and you see the thermal like bubbles here, discrete pockets of higher vertical velocity amid the weaker shear environment. Whereas strong shear, you see a strong storm relative inflow leading to stronger vertical mass flux, wider updraft, and also stronger updraft as a result of that. Now, there's been some evidence in the recent literature, relatively recent literature, that if you get a wider and stronger updraft, you can produce a wider region of hydrometeor mass within that bigger upward moving air plume. So these again were simulations showing cloud mass, rain mass, snow mass, and hail mass, vertical profiles for different upper level shear variations. So the darker the color, the weaker the shear, and then the lighter the color, the stronger the shear. And generally you see, as you increase the shear aloft, you create wider updrafts that can support greater cloud, rain, snow, and hail mass within inside of them. So there's been some evidence for this, and this will be some of the themes that I'll be looking at with the research that I'm presenting here. Now, there's been this proposed connection between the size of updrafts and the size of downdrafts, cold pools, and precip areas. A nice paper that came out by Marion and Trapp showed that updrafts scale with downdrafts, right? So a wider region of upward moving air leads to a wider region of downward moving air, which then leads to a deeper cold pool beneath the storm, and also leads to a larger region of precipitation output from that bigger storm. So robust relationships were shown, again, with these independent set of simulations here. So some of these previous studies have only looked at shear variations across a fixed layer, whether it's the mid-levels or the upper levels. And there hasn't been a systematic study to look at shear variations across different layers and how that influences hydrometeor concentration and displacement, and then the resultant updraft and downdraft characteristics within supercell thunderstorms. So that's sort of the motivation for the work that I'll be showing today, separating these different layers of influence. So first question I'm addressing is, how does varying shear magnitude, not direction like the gray and frame paper, but just shear magnitude across different layers impact hydrometeor concentration and displacement relative to a supercell updraft? For this, we'll be looking at three different layers. A low-level layer in which, at least for surface-based supercells that feed on near-surface air, this is traditionally the inflow layer with the highest CAPE. So 0 to 1, we're calling the low level. Mid-level, 1 to 6, admittedly 1-2 kilometers is not mid-level, right? But we just called it that to separate it from the other levels. This really is the layer in which most studies analyze when they talk about supercell dynamics, right? Setting up that horizontal rotation that then gets tilted into the vertical. Usually people will look at 0 to 6 kilometer shear to discriminate supercells from non-supercells. So that's why we sort of picked that range there. And then finally, upper level, 6 to 12. This is mostly where those strong storm relative winds aloft help to affect precip, at least what we thought out of the updraft was most important in that upper level part of the storm. The second question, which I'll only have time to briefly touch on today, is how do the results we find from one change if we change the background relative humidity of the environment, whether we dry it out or make it more tropical? So the working hypothesis was that if we crank up the shear, especially across deep layers, and affect the storm motion, then we should get wider storms due to that stronger storm relative inflow, which has been already previously shown by numerous studies. Extending this to say we should get wider regions of condensate forming within these bigger updrafts and get greater updraft hydrometeor loading, at least during the initial stages of the storm formation. But with time, those strong storm relative winds aloft will affect or spread out the precipitation down shear, and then lead to a reduction in hydrometeor loading over the course of the simulation, and result in a wider area of precipitation at the ground. So the way I addressed this hypothesis was using, as a common theme, as you saw in the introduction, an idealized cloud model. If you're not familiar with this, it's a useful tool to conduct these systematic studies in which you change one thing in the environment and see how it impacts a storm. For example, in our case, a supercell. So schematic here, think about different sheets of graph paper stacked on top of each other in this three-dimensional cube. And at each grid point, we need to initialize it with a atmospheric profile, vertical profile of temperature, pressure, winds, etc. So traditionally, people will just use a observed sounding or an analytic sounding to initialize each grid point with. So you'll see the term horizontally homogeneous, right? So if you look at one level, everything is the same and things are only changing in the vertical direction. So you may ask, how do you get a storm to form if everything's the same horizontally with no discontinuities? There's a lot of different methods. You can put terrain in there, you can put surface fluxes, momentum forcing. We just stuck with the most basic method in which we plopped a warm perturbation that was like +3 Kelvin warmer than the surrounding grid points, that then rose as a positively buoyant bubble and helped to initiate a single isolated supercell. The model I'm using for this is Cloud Model 1. If you go to any talks in the severe local storms community, or you even go to George Bryan's website, he has a graph now of how many papers cite using this model. It's an exponential curve here. Basically, everyone has now used this model in the severe storms community in some form or fashion. So very popular tool for doing these sort of systematic studies. So I'm not going to read off everything here. At the end, we can come back to this, but just some important specs. These are pretty basic simulations. No evolving base states, no surface fluxes, no terrain, no Coriolis. Pretty high resolution, especially in the vertical. And then we did test 2 different microphysics schemes and also altered the cloud droplet number concentration in one of the schemes to test the hydrometeor loading aspect of the simulations. All right, so how did we initialize these are those grid points? We used a modified classical analytic sounding that's been or has been used quite a bit in the literature, the Weisman-Clem sounding. The original sounding is shown in the skew T-log P diagram. The black line is environmental temperature. The dashed line is environmental dew point. Hopefully this is review for most folks. The red line is a lifted surface-based parcel, an adiabatic parcel, showing just a little bit of sin and fairly moderate values of CAPE. And later, when I briefly showed the relative humidity sensitivity, we had 3 different dew point profiles, relative humidity profiles. The green is what I'm calling moist, and that's the original Weisman-Clem sounding. The black is our control, and the brown is the dry simulations. In the table here, you see CAPE, sin, and then the layer in which CAPE was the highest, sin was the lowest. We tried to keep those approximately constant between the different relative humidity simulations. So yeah, you can see CAPE, sin were all the same, and the inflow layer depth was approximately the same here. Now, in terms of the shear, right, so we needed to give it a thermodynamic profile and then a shear profile. We wanted to spin up supercells, so we used a very classic sideways L-shaped profile, which has been observed in near storm supercell environments, with a sharp turning of the wind shear vector at 1 kilometer altitude. So each of these are hodograph plots. The green segments are 0 to 1 kilometer winds. The red is 1 to 6, and the cyan is 6 to 12. So we had a weak shear and a strong shear for each of those layers, just to keep it simple. And then the black stars here are actual storm motions based on tracking the storms in the simulations. So the storm relative winds can be found by drawing vectors from the star to any point on the hodograph. And you can see that the length of the arrows are bigger in these simulations with the stronger shear than in these simulations with the weaker shear. So we can already tell by increasing the shear, we're increasing the storm motion and the storm relative flow of the simulations. All right, so let's look at the control simulations. First, I'll just show you these 8 animations. First thing right off the bat, you'll notice all of them produce storms, which is what we wanted. They all produce an isolated rightward moving supercell after an initial period of storm splitting. So that first hour we disregard, and then we only track the right moving supercell. The shaded is reflectivity near the ground. The blue is the cold pool outline, and then the black, which admittedly is hard to see, but I'll zoom in a minute. That is the mid-level updraft contour, 20 meters per second. So if your eyes are sharp enough, you can tell that the right 4 storms tend to be bigger than the left 4 storms over here, with bigger updrafts and cold pools that don't undercut the updraft as much. So if we pause this, zoom in, and we do a composite over the middle portion of the simulation, 90 to 180 minutes, you can really see this stand out more. So again, everything's the same in terms of the plot convention. We're just zoomed in here now. And the biggest differences we see are in the left 4 panels and the right 4 panels. And those are variations in the 1 to 6 kilometer shear. So right 4 panels with stronger shear in the mid levels, you get bigger updrafts, bigger storm size, precip area, and a cold pool that's more in line with the updraft than out ahead of the updrafts like these ones here. If you go top to bottom, that's changing low level shear. You don't really see much change. If you go left to right, that's changing upper level shear. And not much change in the updraft structure, but there is slightly greater down shear spread of precip if you crank up the upper level shear a little bit. All right, that's all qualitative, right, which is great, but if we make it more quantitative, these are now looking at time series over that 90-minute time period. In the top left panel is mid-level updraft size, so that is those black contours. What is the size of that area? And again, I'm using like a 20 meter per second updraft threshold. And then panel B is the size of the near surface reflectivity area. So I think I used like 20 dBz or something like that and calculated the area of that precipitation core. So what we find is that just like we saw in the animations and the plan views, the red and blue show the different mid-level shear variations, with the dashed and the thicker or thinner showing the low and mid-level or low and upper level shear variations. But the biggest bifurcation is changes in the mid-level shear, where again, if you increase the mid-level shear, you get a bigger storm, which results in a wider area of reflectivity near the ground. And if you take a percent difference between the high shear member and the low shear member in each shear layer group, and just plot the percent difference here in the bottom, you can see for mid-level, anything that's positive, it means it's bigger in the stronger shear simulation group. And we see that generally is strongly positive and bigger than any of the changes due to low level or upper level shear. So that's time series. If we look at vertical profiles of actual updraft characteristics in these cores, here I'm showing this is a composite again over a 90-minute time period. Core updraft area with height. And panel A here. Panel B is moist static energy within the updraft. And then panel C and D relates to the hydrometeor loading. So panel C is, if I add up all the hydrometeor species, what are their mixing ratios in the updraft? And panel D is how many hydrometeors are existing in the updraft relative to the whole domain around the right moving supercell. So not surprisingly, we see bigger updrafts, not only in the mid-levels, but all throughout the depth of the troposphere if we increase mid-level shear. They are slightly less diluted. Their moist static energy is closer to the background environment, or I'm sorry, less close to the background environment, showing that there's less entrainment of environmental air. There's slightly greater hydrometeor loading aloft, especially above 6 kilometers. And also there's a greater fraction of hydrometeors existing in the updraft than the whole domain here. The bottom panels show, again, the percent differences are largest due to the changes in the mid-level shear layer. It really stands out if we look at just the core updraft area, and now we're looking at either low-level shear changes, mid-level, or upper-level shear. And then the sort of the range I'm showing here is over that 90-minute period. So what is the core updraft area at each 10-minute output time? And I put the range there to show you the range of outcomes, and then the mean value in the thick lines here. And you see the distributions in the mid-level shear drastically different from one another, whereas they have strong overlap if we change low-level or upper-level shear. Slight increases in updraft size for increasing upper-level shear, and even a slight decrease for increases in low-level shear, which still trying to reconcile. But again, the main theme here is that 1 to 6 kilometer layer really seems to be driving these biggest differences here. If we then try to compare this to upward motion, downward motion, and also the buoyancy within these updrafts, if you have stronger mid-level shear, you get stronger updrafts in the maximum sense. And also if you take an average across the updraft, especially in the low layers of the atmosphere, low to mid-levels, and stronger downdrafts throughout the depth of the troposphere here. We'll come back to this point in a minute here. But systematically stronger downdrafts all the way from the tropopause down, or the equilibrium level all the way down into the boundary layer. Now, in terms of buoyancy, since they're wider updrafts, right, they retain more of their core buoyancy. They're less diluted by entrainment. And as a result, there is slightly greater buoyancy, both aloft and in the low levels of the atmosphere. Whether you're looking at total buoyancy, including hydrometeor loading, or just looking at the thermal contribution to buoyancy in an average or maximum sense, they both look the same. Again, biggest differences, the red lines tend to be bigger magnitudes than the green or the cyan lines. All right. So one of the main things I was discussing in the intro was how far this precip is able to be displaced away from the updrafts. So that's what's shown here in time series again. Red line is the separation distance between the updraft centroid and the precip core centroid at the ground. Same panel convention. The left 4 are the weak mid-level shear. The right 4 are the strong mid-level shear. You see generally these 4 on the left have average separation distances 10 to 15, 16 kilometers, and they remain relatively steady. Whereas in the right 4 panels, the separation distance increases over time with mean values closer to 20 to 23, 24 kilometers. So that's that idea that as the storm is tapping into deeper layers of the shear, right, and the stronger storm relative winds, it's helping to displace some of that precip down shear of the updraft. This was a quick aside question that came up, was what layer of storm relative winds determine where the precip will fall out, what direction. So here I show vertical profiles of the composite, again, over a 90-minute period. Of the blue lines are the centroid separation between the updraft and the precip. So what angle relative to one another are those separated? And then the storm relative wind direction in the sort of salmon colors. I think that's the Python name for it, salmon. So wherever they're aligned, that means that the storm relative winds and the separation angle are in the same direction. And we see for all of the shear simulations, it's really the storm relative winds above 4 to 5 kilometers that really determine where the precip is being advected. All right, so regardless of shear magnitude, this seems to be a consistent story. All right, the last thing looking at is how does that precip that's evected out of the updraft, how does it affect the near storm environment? So here are now vertical profiles again, looking at hydrometeor characteristics outside of the core updraft, so adjacent to it, down shear. If we look at panel A here, these are, again, vertical profiles of hydrometeor mass, all the species added up together. And we see that there's just more hydrometeor mass existing outside of updrafts in those stronger shear simulations. And then we broke down the microphysical processes, condensation, evaporation, sublimation, etc. And we see that low-level rainwater evaporation increases and ice sublimation aloft increases because you simply have more hydrometeor mass to evaporate, to sublimate in those stronger shear environments, which is likely driving those stronger downdrafts throughout the depth of the troposphere there. Again, the biggest difference, as you can see, owe to the changes in the mid-level shear here. There are some interesting things going on with the low-level shear with a reverse sign here that we can try and hypothesize after the talk, but the biggest changes in a positive sense are in the level shear. All right, and just to drive home the point of where these regions of sublimation and rainwater evaporation occur relative to the storms, these are showing the composites again of the right moving storm, reflectivity now in the red shaded colors, orange shaded colors. The updraft is still the same in the black. The green is that rainwater evaporation below the melting level in the lime colors, and then the blue is upper level ice sublimation. You see that the number of contours and the aerial extent increases in the stronger shear simulations, right? This is a bit clearer to see if we take a composite cross-section through these, which is shown here. The black is updraft. Everything else is the same. Blue, ice sublimation. Green is rainwater evaporation. And you see, especially in the down shear to the right on these plots, you just get more of these contours, right? So there's more ice sublimating and rain evaporating outside of the main core updraft in those stronger shear environments. All right. So a quick detour to talk about the sensitivity of these simulations to free tropospheric relative humidity before we wrap up, and then talk more about future avenues to apply some of this stuff. So we reran those free tropospheric relative humidity variations only for a weak shear and strong shear in the mid-levels, because again, that showed the biggest differences. Just a refresher, right? We had the moist simulation in the green line, the control, which is what I've been showing you so far in the black, and then the driest in the brown line here. I won't go through all of the same plots, but one thing that was interesting was that if you looked outside of the core updraft, right, in the down shear direction, what you find is that if you have a moister environment, you can support more hydrometeor mass outside of the updraft. And that actually leads to greater, which you can see here, the green lines for strong shear and solid, weak shear in dashed are to the right of the brown and black lines. This actually supports greater rates of ice sublimation and rainwater evaporation in the moister environment, which at first did not make sense to me, at least, right? I thought drier environment, you should have more ice sublimation, more rainwater evaporation, but it all ties back to the fact you just have more hydrometeor mass to evaporate, to sublimate in the moister environment. So that's what the explanation was for these two results here. All right, so main summary from the research topic here. The strongest mid-level shear, right, in that 1 to 6 kilometer layer, and which I didn't show too much of, but if you increase the relative humidity across the free troposphere. You get wider updrafts, less dilute updrafts they realize more of their buoyancy and thus they're stronger, and you get more hydrometeor loading. Greater downshear spread and area of precip, right? A bigger precip footprint at the ground if you have stronger shear. More hydrometeor mass outside of the updraft, which I just showed, leading to greater rates of ice sublimation, rainwater evaporation. And the whole point of this research was tied to a proposal that we have funded to look at downdrafts and deep convection. So one of the questions was, how do updrafts and the spatial distribution of precip affect downdrafts? And we see that in stronger shear, you get stronger downdrafts throughout the depth of the troposphere because we have more hydrometeor mass that's affected outside of the updraft. And also stronger loading in those updrafts. The results were less sensitive if we change the low-level inflow shear or the upper-level storm relative wind layer shear, right? And I don't show it here, but if we swap out the microphysics scheme to a completely different one or change the properties of the microphysics scheme we were using originally, we get the same consistent results that are shown here in the blue. All right, but I'm happy to show the slides, but I don't have time to explicitly talk about them now. All right, so the last bit here, I wanted to save some time to talk about ongoing work and avenues for future work, collaborations potentially that could pop up. Before I talk about that, there is some support for some of the results I've showed in the literature. This was a study in 2017 by Jeff Snyder and others. These were admittedly more simulation results, but they actually were tying to radar observations. So they had these different shaped photographs, semicircles or quarter circles, straight photographs with a weak and a strong shear as well, like I was showing. And what they were doing is looking at polarimetric radar variables, such as differential reflectivity columns and the area of that, shown here on the bottom x-axis. On the left panel here, looking at the area of the differential reflectivity column just above the freezing level, and how does that correlate to updrafts, so the size of updrafts, to see if we can maybe use CDR columns as a proxy for determining updraft size and observations of radar. And there's a pretty strong relationship, especially in the stronger shear simulations, right, to where the area of the differential reflectivity column pretty well correlated with the area of the updraft at the same height. And then if you look at the area of the differential reflectivity column versus the area of the rainwater mixing ratio at the same height, again, those two things are pretty well correlated. So there's some evidence that maybe we can glean some details about the size of updrafts from observations of some polarimetric radar variables. I currently have one master's student who's trying to look at the linkage with observations between supercell size in terms of its reflectivity pattern and the background environmental shear. So his name is Alex Colgate. He's just started with me. He's in his second semester now. He's using this grid radar product, which is admittedly a bit of a coarser resolution than if you're just looking at pure 88D radar data because it's gridded to a Cartesian grid. But at least trying to build up big statistics of many supercells amongst many different shear environments and seeing if there is these relationships between precip size and shear strength. He came not too far away from Millersville, and he's originally from New Jersey. I told Alex, I'm like, can you send me a professional headshot? And then he takes a picture outside and sends me this photo, which is the closest he got to a professional headshot, but it came out pretty good. One thing too I'd like to leverage, and Mike and I have talked about this a bit, is some of the tools that y'all have developed here at Stony Brook, such as, if I say it incorrectly, please correct me, but M-trends, right? Calculating differential reflectivity column areas objectively from radar data. and trying to compare it to environmental properties such as shear, like I've shown today. In this study, they were looking at, for example, the size of ZDR columns between non-tornadic and tornadic supercells. I'd be interested in extending this to looking at the size of column areas based on the background shear magnitude. All right. So I'd like to pause here, and we've got about like 12 minutes left. Before I take questions, I like to thank Dr. Michael French for the invitation to come down here and give the seminar. Also Trish, I don't think I've seen her yet, but I have to try and stop by and say thank you. If you're interested, you can try and scan this QR code. I'm still new to using these things. It's probably way too big on the screen here, and hopefully it didn't expire. I used one of those free QR generators that expire after some time. I'd like to thank ASR for funding some of this research. And if you want to reach me at email or tweet at me or X at me, you can send me something there. So yeah, I'll pause there and take any questions you have. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jake. That was great. Happy to take questions now from anybody. Yeah, Brian.
So you show this association with shear and updraft.
Yeah.
So
right.
I'm just trying to understand the dynamics a little bit.
Yes.
Causing that is that explainable through just from past studies with supercells with pressure perturbations with shear interacting with existing updrafts, or
it's
and is there a dynamical connection in terms of the storm?
Right. That's a great question, and a bit of a contentious one still, I think, in the field, our subfield. So there was this 2019 paper that came out by John and others that sort of laid foundational theory for relating shear strength to storm relative inflow magnitude, and then invoking a mass continuity argument that the amount of horizontal mass flux should result in greater vertical mass flux and a widening of an updraft. There's been pushback about that, like, how does the inflow know to go into an updraft and not pass underneath it, right? Or yeah, some of the other folks are like, isn't it the dynamical forcing that's driving the inflow, right? So I think there's still some open debate about that, right? And in the stronger shear simulations, some of that low-level updraft boost is definitely dynamically forced, right? But at least in supercells, the maximum rotation tends to peak at like 4, 5, 6 kilometers. So from the dynamical sense, below the level of max rotation, you get upward acceleration, but above that, you get downward acceleration. And thermodynamic buoyancy takes over a lot. That's where you tend to see the strongest updrafts. So I think there's still credence to storm relative inflow and wider updrafts being less diluted that help determine the maximum strength of updrafts aloft. With some contribution down low from the dynamical effects for sure. But I don't think you can fully explain W max aloft purely from a dynamical standpoint. Yeah. There's also been some other work about like how much kinetic energy is in the inflow is projected into the vertical and is converted to vertical kinetic energy or whatever, but yeah.
Well, I guess
some more theoretical. So, yeah.
These all have the same amount of cape, right? So
yeah, roughly.
If you produce a pressure perturbation at mid levels,
yes,
with the shear interacting with whatever the initial updraft, then you just have a broader area that you're bringing up there
for sure.
And then that just gets it going, and then you have a broad updraft, and then all the non-dilution takes over.
Exactly. Yeah,
I'm trying to get the order of operation here.
That's the biggest thing too. It's like folks, for example, like Morris Weissman and others harp more on like that driving it than the inflow driving it. I think they're almost inseparable. Like I think it's probably some feedback, right? Like the dynamic forcing and the propagation is helping to lead to stronger inflow, and then maybe driving the wider updraft. So personally, I don't like to pick size. I think it's a continuum of things going on, but like kind of walk the middle line there. Especially early in my career, I don't want to, step on anyone's toes, but yeah. Eric, great question.
Yeah, I don't modeling substantially, it's not a great question. I was thinking about the initial warm bubble that initiated your storm. And I was wondering if it's common to vary in size or intensity, and if that would influence the size of your storm. And furthermore, if there is a way of doing that, is it based on like, oh, this is what it usually looks like, so we go for the size, or this is what gets us a storm?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great question. And it was something we, I know the paper I showed with Jeff Marion, he had reviewers ask this question, and then we also redid it for ours. It's pretty, what is the word, anemic to the initial size of the forcing. After the first 15-20 minutes, the environment really dictates the final size of the updraft, at least in these simulations. Like once you get that initial pulse and get an established storm, it seems like the environment takes over. And I've initiated storms with a range of bubble sizes. They all converge to the same storm size in the same environment. So yeah, that could be because it's just a pulse. If I had like some more momentum forcing or some terrain forcing that was continuous, maybe, yeah, it would be more important for then affecting the storm size. But the way we did it here, the impact of that, and that's why we kind of threw out that first hour anyway, not only because of the splitting process, but the initiation method, right? So I definitely would not want to try and do this with like a CI study or something, right? Like that, yeah.
Pablo.
Yeah.
Jake, great talk.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the state. I was looking, how realistic are the updrafts you guys make in the simulations? I was ballparking.
Yeah.
You're generous to 30 meters updraft, and the smallest areas you had was about 20 square kilometers.
Yeah.
That's about the footprint of GOES. And if you're 30 meters, not 60 that you have.
Yeah.
In 5 minutes, you are up 10 kilometers. That's a 65 Kelvin drop. We could see that from space. I don't think we have ever seen a 65 Kelvin drop over the conus over 10 years now.
Right.
So how realistic are these sizes and the magnitudes of the outputs you actually generate?
Great question. And especially in an idealized modeling framework, I think that's a limitation. I mean, and we've talked about this a little bit, like I've seen updrafts in these simulations that are over 100 meters per second. And whether that's ever to be observed or not, waits to be seen. I mean, they used to fly the aircraft through storms, right? The strongest I've seen in the literature from the T8 or whatever, was it T8 or what? Through that Montana supercell was like 50 meters per second. I know there was a vertically pointing radar or LiDAR or whatever in Oklahoma that measured like 50-60 meter per second updrafts.
There's also a group that launched weather balloons directly into updrafts, and it was also about 50 meters
Was
per
that
second.
balls?
I can't remember.
The
if it was.
swarm of balloons? or-
No.
Oh, a different.
like actual radiosonic.
Oh, okay.
They
yeah.
parked themselves right under the updraft and let it get
Yeah,
sucked
and
up.
it was around, yeah.
Yeah.
I know Paul Markowski and stuff, he had groups go out and launch like, they call them swarms of small balloons with instruments. And I want to say he had ascent rates close to 70 meters per second. If I were betting, man, I actually think that some atmospheric convection does get close to this, especially in supercells, but that's just me. I mean, we don't have observations of that, but I don't think it's physically impossible. Yeah, of course, we need better observing systems to maybe see that.
So to kind of piggyback on that, something I talked a little bit with John.
Yeah,
Yeah, is how so for example, when you're calculating updraft areas.
Yep.
How do you define an updraft?
Yeah, that's another great question.
Because like, when we're using proxies like a ZVR column,
Right.
and I was telling you this, that requires a minimum, if we're looking 1 kilometer above the freezing level, that requires a vertical velocity that's probably greater than 10 meters per second. But I like in a lot of John's simulations, you're using like a 3 meter per second cutoff or something
Right.
like that. So like for what you showed, how did you calculate area? What was your cutoff or what's an updraft?
Yeah, so we were calling core updraft areas. That was like a 20 meter per second.
Okay, so that was
Yeah,
pretty
it's
strong.
just pretty strict. And then we tested like 15, 25, 10 based on reviewer questions, but
So was there great sensitivity to that?
the same trend, the values changed, but the same trends were the same. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I know Chris Notarski has done like a percentile method before, like instead of fixed W thresholds. But he argued to me there's a downfall for doing that. I forgot what it was. Either way, you have to make a choice.
But is in modeling studies, is there some standard that is used, or does it just seem to be kind of?
Seems pretty user.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've seen 5, 10, 3, 20. Yep.
So yeah, it seems pretty user specific. So
Yeah.
that's a difference.
Pretty subjective. Yeah.
We can't control when we use observational proxies, when we're going to see the proxy and when we're not.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So that's always going to be a difference. Other questions? All right. Let's thank Jake again.
Thank you guys. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to see if Zoom had any questions, but I don't see any.
Oh,
So,
yeah, I don't see.
yeah, I don't see any. Okay.
So we're gonna move over to lunch, and you can come say hi to Jake. Hope to see you there.
Hey, Mike, Mingla has a question, but can we hear him?
Yes, I have a question. Can you hear?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so one is about the vertical shear. In your initial profile, you have a depth of moist air about 3 kilometers. Do you think that depth could be related to the level of vertical shear that matters?
We're trying to turn up the volume. It's having a hard time to hear. It sounds like it's coming out of underneath. Maybe just that, but that might be for us. It's all the way up.
Yeah, Mike, never mind. I don't want to delay your lunch.
Oh no, that we can hear you better now. Go ahead.
Okay, so in your initial profile, the depth of the moist layer is about 2 to 3 kilometers. Do you think that depth could matter to the level of vertical shear? That
Oh,
would
I see.
impact the storm?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think, yeah, we purposely tried to make the moist layer pretty deep to make sure we got sustained storms, because if we had a shallower moist layer or we dried it out too quickly, too low, like we just couldn't sustain storms. So that kind of was a bit artificial to make sure we got a sustained storm. But I think that's an important question. Like a lot of times you'll see boundary layers that are a lot drier than that, right? And I think the shear in that layer could be important. Another thing too was like, we haven't varied shear in smaller increments. Like we did big 0 to 1 to 6, 6 to 12. We want to look at shallower layers now and try to pinpoint some of those more intricacies of the layers of shear. Yeah.
Thank you. The other quick question is about the cold pole. Did
Okay.
you look at the strength of the cold pole related with the relative humidity and the vertical shear, which would impact the hydro medium. So you have two factors, right?
Yeah.
One is the amount of hydro mediums, another is the relative humidity.
So personally, no, but one of my co-authors did look into this, and at least he found that stronger shear led to stronger cold pools, and then also higher relative humidity led to stronger cold pools. At least in the free tropospheric and boundary layer sense, right? Like, I'm sorry. So in the boundary layer sense, having a drier boundary layer, he had stronger cold pools. But if you moistened the free troposphere, you had stronger cold pools. And then in terms of shear, it was just stronger cold pools with stronger shear because you had bigger storms.
Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. And if you have any more questions, you can email me or we can set up a Zoom or something.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, Ming-Hua.
thank you. Bye-bye.